Hey, what's going on, everybody? It is your favorite self-proclaimed master here, aka Timalik, and thank you so much for checking out my first story here on YouTube. This is a short story that I wrote live on stream at www.twitch.tv/Timalik. If you guys want to be a part of writing these short stories, be sure to check me out on there. But without further ado, here is The Beast of Secrets. Aberdeen was known for its placid beauty by only a select few. It was the sort of gem one would have to have keen eyes to find on a map, the sort of place people only ever saw from the windows of planes that flew overhead. Rolling green hills and rocky beaches were all that separated the small town of Aberdeen from a seemingly infinite Scottish countryside. It was relaxing, serene, and incredibly boring for the few young people that lived within the town's reaches. Clayton Boys was one of these unlucky few. Clayton was part of a graduating class made of 30 other students. He'd lived his entire 16 years within 20 square miles and often fantasized about a life anywhere but Aberdeen. He spent the overcast afternoons of his formative years exploring every feature of the weathered cliffs and rolling grassy hills surrounding the town. Clayton had no urge to be a great Scottish outdoorsman, had no connection to nature, and the enchanting beauty of the Aberdeen countryside was all but lost on the boy. He wished for a life of excitement and adventure, one which would allow him to meet new people, experience different cultures, and expose him to all the lessons life had to offer. Sadly, though, Clayton was trapped. At least, he believed he was. Clayton's adoptive parents, Deuce and Ben, were complacent and overprotective. They loved Clayton more than he knew and provided him with everything they could. They'd fled the big city life of Belfast in Northern Ireland in order to provide a calm and nurturing childhood for Clayton. What they thought would be a peaceful transition into a relaxing retirement turned sour when the suburban villagers of Aberdeen met their alternative lifestyle with hate and disgust. People felt sorry for Clayton. They were ashamed that a good kid like him would have to grow up with the blight of gay parents, but the adversity which had once plagued every corner of the boy's mind, he now saw as a cherished opportunity to show that bigoted hatred could be met with kindness. After a few years, nobody cared anyway, and Clayton and his parents were accepted into the melancholy known as Aberdeen life. It was an overcast Tuesday afternoon, one which would have normally become a part of the blended boredom of Clayton's life. As he walked from school to home, his thoughts stewed on a single, light-hearted conversation shared between his friends. It wasn't abnormal for Clayton's group of friends to poke fun at the insecurities they had. It was a method of bonding, and normally the disses and insults didn't affect Clayton, but anything that brought his family's character into question always struck a nerve with the boy. "Nice shirt, Reuben. Mommy ironed that for you?" Clayton had called down the school hallway at his friend. "I'd make a joke about yours, but nobody knows where she is anyway," he called back. Clayton let his cheap sneakers drag on the pavement of that Aberdeen sidewalk, his body slowing with the sting of the words that echoed in his head. He knew not to take Reuben's words seriously, and he knew that Reuben only meant the best by sharing smack talk with him. None of this helped soothe the pain. Clayton often shut down when he was upset. Sharing conversation with his parents never did seem to help, but a few hours alone could often take the worst situations and turn them for the better. He knew he needed time alone, and so when he arrived at their squat suburban home, he tossed his backpack aside and left once more to the cool outdoors. There was something about the wet Aberdeen air that bred silence through all the towns, hamlets, and villages in its presence. Save the occasional hum of traffic or tolling of bells in the distance, when Clayton was alone outside, the sound of his own thoughts and footsteps were the only things he heard. He took a turn away from his home and made his way up one of the many rolling hills behind his family's property. It was all farmland, as far as the eye could see, and though he had no claim to the pastures and crops, he'd never been noticed trespassing. Clayton would often hike through these fields and hills to get to a cliff which overlooked the North Sea. The steady waves and rhythms that the water produced calmed him, and when Clayton wanted to be alone, he always came to the same spot. However, more than the cliff itself, more than the water and the sounds and the smell of salt in the air, there was only one living thing which existed that could always bring a smile to Clayton's face, and that was Andrew the cow. Andrew wasn't a name given to this particular heifer by its owner. It was just a moniker that Clayton had assigned to it in order to have something to call the cow. As he neared the top of the hill which led to his favorite cliff, he saw Andrew standing there. Andrew had his head down, gorging himself on the tufts of Scottish green which were kept short by the grazing and moving of the animals. As Clayton drew closer, Andrew's massive head rose and turned to him, still chewing on cud while Clayton walked. "Hey, buddy," Clayton whispered, patting Andrew on the head. Andrew rose his head to Clayton's hand, a silent token of his appreciation for the affection. "I brought you something, I did." Clayton reached into the pocket of his worn green jacket and produced a plump pear, breaking it in two before offering half to Andrew the cow. Andrew took the halved pear in his flat teeth, and Clayton smiled, patted Andrew once more, and walked past the cow and towards his cliff. Clayton sat on the rocky plateau and cleared his mind, allowing the ebb and flow of the water below to replace all the thoughts in his head, the crashing of salt water on rock, the vibrations pulsing through the stone beneath him, the smell of farmland and water all swirled in the boy's mind. It relaxed Clayton, soothed him. He brought the other half of the pear to his mouth and ate, silent and alone in the great Scottish landscape. Clayton closed his eyes, allowing his emotions their rare chance to boil through the mask he wore to keep them controlled. He wiped away a tear from one of his now reddened blue eyes and stared once more out at the vast sea before him. He wanted so badly to be anybody but himself, to live anywhere but where he did. He loved his family, loved his friends, and knew he had a good life, but his perspective was so clouded by the scars of his past that everything felt murky. It was as if two parts of his brain were at war, trying to control him. There was the rational, intelligent side that assured him everything would be fine, that there was nothing he could be doing more to make his life better than it was. This part of his mind told him that he was simply a victim of circumstance, that his surroundings weighed heavier than the strength he had to control them, and that as time passed, he would become stronger. Then the emotional side of his brain stepped in and brought all the what-ifs into question. What if he wasn't good enough to make it in the world? What if he was too stupid, too weak, too lazy to bring about any real change? What if he didn't matter? What if he was destined to be like all the other people he knew? What if he was to be normal? He wondered if he would ever get the chance to escape from the mediocrity of Aberdeen, if he would ever see the world. Clayton let this side of his brain take over from time to time, and he knew it was to blame for his sadness, not the words of his friend Reuben. Just as Clayton was coming to this emotional catharsis, he heard a slight cry from the land around him. It wasn't human. He'd heard enough of the sound to know that, but he couldn't quite place a thought on what exactly the noise was. He'd nearly convinced himself that he'd heard the caw of a bird or the whistle of a groundhog before the sound came forth again, slightly louder. It was too muffled to decipher, like the metal parts of a wind chime being pushed together and not allowed to ring, as if some clear and beautiful noise was being stifled and was not allowed to grow to its full potential. It cried out again, whatever it was, and the rumbling of the ground around Clayton's cliff felt less rhythmic and more constant. The soft, blonde hairs on the back of the boy's neck stood on end with the chill in the air and the mystery of the cry he'd heard. The cry continued, bleeding out from the ground around him, growing louder and seeming to come from all directions at the same time. The enchanting effect of the salty Aberdeen air, which normally demanded silence, seemed to have no effect on the cry. The sound of the ocean should have drowned it out with its constant waves and its enormous power, but the cry was unaffected. It came louder, more frequent, and Clayton could feel the warmth drain from his face and sweat building on his forehead. The boy got to his feet, wanting to run, needing to exercise some control over what was happening, but his cliff was supposed to be a safe place, a haven where nobody and nothing could affect him. He'd come to this cliff to relax for as long as he could remember, and never in all those years did something come to disturb him. But something about the cry, albeit terrifying, brought a new emotion to Clayton's mind. The sound was unlike any animal that Clayton had heard before, but somehow he could tell that it was living. In fact, he could deduce more than just that it was alive. He knew that it was a cry for help. Clayton didn't know how he'd come to this conclusion, but now that he'd let the ringing cry fill his mind over and over again, he hadn't a doubt that whatever was making this noise needed his help. He thought for a moment, bewildered, and let his panicked blue eyes search the surrounding rocky cliff for any sign of life. He couldn't see movement, but there was a change, so small, so minute in the landscape, that he doubted anybody but himself would have noticed. It was a crevice in the rock. Normally the stone he sat on was smooth, with only a gleam of green moss during certain parts of the year. It was flat and boring, without deformation or character, but there was a groove worn where it shouldn't have been, as if part of his cliff had collapsed and revealed new, rough rock that hadn't seen the light of day in 1,000 years. He approached, careful to keep his wits about him and his feet prepared to run. Clayton was afraid, more scared than he'd ever been, but then again, nothing dangerous lived in Scotland, he thought. When he'd come close to the edge of the cliff, he saw the monster in the crevice. The creature looked like a sheep with burning hot, white horns that let loose wisps of milky steam through the cool Scottish air. Thin strands of white silk grew from atop its head and flowed over the skinny, jagged frame of the monster. It had skin black as midnight and teeth like a rabbit, so deformed it seemed impossible. As Clayton drew closer, the thing hissed like air escaping from a burning log, and the boy stumbled back towards the safety of the green pasture behind him. He kept an eye on the creature, unsure of what to do, but the thing continued to cry out its same painful cry. Reactions to what he'd seen clumsily struggled through Clayton's shocked mind. He immediately found a million excuses to pardon the monster from the realm of being supernatural, made himself believe that it was some deformed animal destined to die. Without as much thought as it should have taken, Clayton found a rock twice the size of a baseball and smashed it into the monster's skull. He wanted to put it out of its misery, and without even enough courtesy to make sure the thing was dead, he ran back towards his home. That night, from the comfort of his own bedroom, Clayton lay awake and thought of the horrible thing he'd done. He was conflicted. Were his actions out of compassion or fear? Was the animal he'd killed destined to die? In the dark, still night, he heard a single dog howl at the moon over the Scottish countryside. Clayton put both of his arms behind his head and glanced at the clock on the end table by his bed. It was nearly 2 a.m. His cliffside relaxation, having been interrupted, put a major crack in his mental state, and the boy could not stop his mind from racing. All through the next day he shared with his classmates at school, Clayton couldn't help sending his gaze adrift towards the windows and casting his eyes over the land he'd stained with blood. The once beautiful grasses and hills now reminded him only of the monster he'd murdered. He took another life, though it was only an animal, a deformed creature at that. He couldn't help but feel remorseful for his actions. He knew he needed to revisit the cliff. He needed to confront what he'd done, and Clayton didn't so much as stop at home before making his way towards the North Sea that day. He knew this day was an off one. It wasn't filled with the same ingredients that made up his boring life, and when he passed the field which Andrew the cow normally occupied, he stopped for a brief moment. It was entirely abnormal for Andrew to not be there. Cows were creatures of habit, only leaving to graze or to be slaughtered, and Clayton could only hope that Andrew had chose the former and not succumbed to the latter. This day had changed suddenly from strange to terrible. What Clayton saw when he arrived at the cliff made him question his own sanity. There was nothing astray about the stone. It was smooth as he remembered it from all of his childhood memories. No sight of new rough rock or the crevice he'd found the creature in. In fact, there was no evidence that the creature had been there at all. Clayton scratched his head and searched his entire cliff for the body of the creature. He'd wondered if the thing had not tried to crawl away and managed to fling itself off the cliff and into the sea beneath. Partially relieved, mostly anxious, Clayton sat in his usual space and stared out at the vastness of the water in front of him, trying to enjoy what he'd previously considered the safest place in his life. He hadn't returned home until the blackness of night had nearly engulfed the town of Aberdeen. Once inside and sure that Ben and Deuce, his adoptive parents, wouldn't question what he'd done with his day, he removed his shoes, set his backpack on the kitchen table, and made his way towards the comfort of his bedroom. Pushing open the door, Clayton screamed at the sight of what lay within. The blood, the viscera, the sheer carnage of what he saw produced the strongest reaction his young body could muster. His friend, his silent pear-eating companion, Andrew the cow, now decorated the boy's bedroom with blood, guts, and stench. The dirty clothes which littered Clayton's bedroom floor were stained deep red with cattle's blood. The walls, like splatter art, presented pieces of meat and organs hung in bone frames. Intestines draped down from the ceiling and hung in front of the cow's head, which was now laying gently on Clayton's pillow. Clayton fell backwards through his bedroom doors, spitting up vomit and shaking with fear. "Dad, Dad," he called. "Ben, Deuce, please." Clayton scrambled down the hallway on all fours like a rabid animal desperate to find help. He tore away at the carpeting and moved faster than he imagined he was capable of moving, tumbling down the staircase and only getting to his feet once on the lowest level of their home. Having heard the commotion their son had made, Ben and Deuce burst forth from their bedroom door in their pajamas and ran downstairs to confront their troubled son. "Clayton, Clayton, what's wrong?" they echoed. Clayton couldn't as much muster a word as point a shaking finger up the stairway towards his bedroom. It's all right," Ben said. "Come on, show us, it's okay." Clayton stared with wide, teary eyes at the stairs, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't want to expose himself to the horror of what had come to Andrew the cow again, but didn't think he'd ever get the image out of his mind either. Deuce walked up the first few stairs, being careful to listen for any signs of danger as he moved. Ben grabbed his son's hand and led him, slowly, gently up the stairway. Once in the hallway, they could hear what sounded like moaning, grunting, and panting, sounds a dog would make, only more human, stranger yet. Once within Clayton's bedroom, Deuce stared in with shock but not disgust. He looked confused, like he'd been expecting to find something worthy of Clayton's hysterical reaction. He gestured for Ben to follow through the door, and Ben continued to lead Clayton by the hand. Inside, all the innards from Andrew the cow had disappeared. It was just Clayton's same old bedroom, his clothes unstained, his walls unadorned with Andrew's cow parts, even his bedding seemed untouched. Clayton shook and quivered with what he could only assume was insanity. It was It was, Clayton stuttered, disgusting, Ben finished. In the midst of his panic and gut-wrenching fear, Clayton had hardly noticed the reason for Ben and Deuce's shock. His entire bedroom was the same as it had been since the start of his teenage years. The posters of Joe F6 II, Clayton's favorite race car driver, the dingy blue carpeting, the crumpled blankets on his bed. At first, the pornography on his computer screen didn't seem out of place in the slightest. "Clayton, what the hell's wrong with you?" Deuce scolded. "Is this one of your jokes?" The boy could feel tears rushing down his face before his mind had even given the order to cry. He'd just let his parents into a room where his favorite porn star, Sammy Love, was naked on his computer monitor, her large naked breasts bouncing as she moaned and panted with joy. Clayton would have thought that given the situation, he'd be incapable of feeling shame or embarrassment, and while those feelings didn't overcome the shock, they still existed and added to the sea of emotions brewing in his mind. He was being played. He knew that much, and he wasn't sure whether he preferred the idea of going insane or being the butt of some cruel and twisted humor. Clayton sobbed, terrified and embarrassed, and felt his knees give way under him. He fell to the floor and wailed like a dying animal. He heard his own cries and screams and couldn't believe that he was making those sounds. The echoes of the screams and crying were low and desperate, entirely unfitting for the simple embarrassment of his parents having been exposed to his pornography. But the sheer weight of what he'd seen previously wouldn't let his body control itself. He felt the strong arms of his adopted father, Deuce, around him as the man attempted to comfort his son. "Clayton," Deuce said with a chuckle, "don't be a drama queen, okay? It's not a big deal. We know you watch this stuff." "It's not." Clayton lifted his head to look his father in the eyes and could see past the man and out his bedroom window. The monster from the crevice, with its white horns and black skin, its flowing silken hair, its bones struggling against the weight of its own body as it perched on the windowsill. Clayton could see the damage he'd caused the beast, a crack in its left horn, the flayed flesh covering its horrible, broken teeth. His brain couldn't process anymore. Clayton couldn't accept that what he was seeing was real, or that this disgusting little monster could have possibly been to blame for what he'd witnessed. Had the beast killed Andrew the cow? How could it have? Clayton's mind ran out of options, out of time to process, and the boy let himself sink into the darkness on the outskirts of his vision. He woke several hours later, having been set on his bed by his father's, the computer monitor no longer lighting the room with the video of Sammy Love. His thoughts felt muddy and slow, and he could hardly remember what had happened. The boy's brain tried to repress what he'd seen, but the images of Andrew's exploded corpse still haunted the inside of his eyelids. Clayton turned his head, 5 o'clock in the morning. The boy swung his feet over the side of his bed and wiped away the dry spit and vomit from his chin. He snorted loudly and tried to rub the pain from his head by massaging his temples. He looked out his bedroom window, and no sign of the beast that had tormented him was there. Clayton sat a while longer in the darkness, trying to make sense of his life. He thought in complete silence with the stillness of the room around him as his only companion. He sat until the sun rose over the Scottish hills and couldn't muster even the most remote idea of what had happened. Once the light from outside had begun to trickle through the boy's blinds, he saw a note laying on his keyboard. "Clayton, it's okay," his father had written. "Whatever is going on, Deuce and I will try our best to help you with, but you've got to talk to us. Please wake me up when you're awake. I love you." Clayton had no urge to speak about what had happened. He felt embarrassed and ashamed. Instead, the boy rummaged around in near darkness and changed his clothes. He washed his face, and as quietly as possible, Clayton left the house. He walked along the Aberdeen streets with his head down and constant glances over his shoulder. The boy didn't know what to do, what he should be afraid of specifically, and how he would be attacked, but Clayton knew he needed to be alone and clear his thoughts. Part of him wished for death, and the idea of throwing himself from the cliffside and crashing into the rocky beach of the North Sea was a comforting one, until the logical side of Clayton's brain took control and assured him. Clayton knew that what had happened was traumatic, and probably a symptom of his Clayton knew that what had happened was traumatic and probably a symptom of his imminent insanity, but not necessarily dangerous for him. If the beast wanted to kill him, it clearly could have, and if it wasn't just a figment of his imagination, then it still wanted something more from the boy. It was a rainy day in Aberdeen, and as Clayton walked with the hood of his green jacket overhead and the sounds of his muddy shoes splashing on the concrete, he tried as hard as he could to keep his composure. The inside of Aberdeen High School was a stark contrast to the dreary day outside. The bright fluorescent lights overhead shone brightly and reflected off of the polished linoleum hallways. Banners hung in support of the sports teams, bulletin boards with notices of student accomplishments and after-school activities hung neatly on the whitewashed concrete block walls, and happy students bustled between classrooms, preparing for their first instruction of the day. As Clayton walked past his peers, he caught their eyes and could hear their hushed chuckling and whispers about him. He was confused by their judgmental stares. Had they heard about what had happened to him the evening previous? Surely, he thought, they couldn't have. His parents were private people, and their house laid far enough away from their closest neighbors to have prevented any observation. He wondered what they could have known about him, the things they thought. "Pervert," he heard someone say from one of the tables in the cafeteria as he passed. He heard a majority of the students around him laughing at the comment as he walked, and while he would have normally had enough fight in him to investigate further, he continued his walk towards his first class. He almost hadn't noticed it. A piece of paper pinned to one of the many bulletin boards, only set apart from the others by the inclusion of his name. When he stopped to read the notice, his heart sank. The Secrets of Clayton Boys. It was hard to believe that one page, a single double-spaced list, could reveal so much about him in such a cold way. It was everything he fought to keep secret. His fantasies about Sammy Love, his favorite porn star, the way he fell asleep to dreams of being Joe F6 II, the race car driver, all of his insecurities, inadequacies, his past, his present. It was all laid out for anybody to see on a dull yellow page. He let his eyes follow the white block wall down the hallway to the next bulletin board and could see the same paper. It was all through the school. Everybody had read it, and there was nothing he could do. If not for the previous night's breakdown, he may have had the energy to rip the paper off of the wall and run through the school, collecting all of them and denying its truth to everybody he saw. But he couldn't. It was all true. Everything on the page, and now everybody knew who he really was. Standing there and shaking his head at the paper was all he could muster. He didn't know how the Beast knew all this information about him, but it didn't matter. He was revealed for everyone to see. Clayton stood there long past the time the first bell had rung for the day. He had perfect attendance in school, but today he simply walked through one of the metal doors and embraced the Aberdeen air. After his hike once again without seeing Andrew the cow, he had arrived at his cliff. The list had told everybody about the things he'd said and not meant, about the teachers who aroused him and the parts of himself that he was ashamed of. Nobody could love the monster he really was. He knew it, and that's why he tried to keep so much away from them. Clayton knew he wasn't a bad person. He knew everybody had secrets, but he also knew that secrets were kept for a reason. He wanted to die. A life where people know those things about him seemed unbearable. What would his parents think of him, his friends, and how long would the torment continue before he'd finally be ready to come to the same decision he was about to make? The silencing Aberdeen air and the steady waves of the ocean soothed him, relaxed him, and as he removed his clothes and folded them neatly on the stone cliff beside him. The silencing Aberdeen air and the steady waves of the ocean soothed him, relaxed him, The silencing Aberdeen air and the steady waves of the sea soothed him, relaxed him as he removed his clothes and folded them neatly on the stone beside him. Clayton Boys stood on the edge of the cliff, staring at the water below and trying to take in as much of the prized Scottish beauty as he could. The salty North Sea air filled his nostrils and lungs as he took deep, mournful breaths. Clayton tried to become one with nature in that moment, letting the soft seaside breezes pass around his naked body and standing still as a tree on his cliff. He reckoned it was as good a place as any to die, that nobody could wish for a more beauty or a nicer setting to be the last they saw. Clayton stood, waiting for a stronger breeze at his back to motivate his balance towards the rocky beach beneath. He could hear it again. The sound of the monster from the crevice crying was as clear as the ringing of crystal in a ballroom. It came through unaltered, unaffected by anything, and in that precise thread of time, all that existed in the world was Clayton and the Beast. He turned, unafraid, to face the horned monster. It stood right at the boy's back, its sunken red eyes transfixed in his. The scarred flesh on its face was the only deviation from the rest of the creature's tight black skin. It stood on two arched legs, more bird-like than the ram it appeared to have once been. As Clayton stared at the thing, it continued crying out, its voice a balancing act between living and mechanical. He could smell its breath, feel the heat coming from its white horns, and the flowing silken hair from its head flowed with the breezes and would tickle Clayton's bare chest from moment to moment. Clayton felt cemented in his standing place. He almost felt it a shame to commit suicide, when clearly the monster before him had put so much effort into the kill. Clayton reached a hand forward, and the beast's glowing red eyes fixed on his movement, confused by the boy's outrage. The monster's skin was as cold as the stone around it, something that came as no surprise to the boy as he placed a hand on the thing's face. "You took everything from me," Clayton whispered to the monster. "I can't go on anymore. You win." Clayton let himself be pushed backwards by the gentle breeze and was surprised when the monster's clawed hand shot out and grabbed his naked shoulder, stopping him from taking his own life. Secrets hurt, the thing hissed with an airy voice like steam from the kettle. This is why I cry. No, die. Cry. I can't, Clayton said as he started to cry. I can't go on. They know everything about me. How am I supposed to live? The boy wailed out and let the warm tears on his face become chilled with the Aberdeen breeze. The beast's sharp fingernail pushed Clayton's chin up, forcing the boy to look into its red eyes. Secrets hurt, the thing repeated. Kill me, be free. In the beast's other hand held the same bloody rock that Clayton had tried to kill the monster with the first time. The monster placed the stone in Clayton's palm and forced the boy to hold it above the monster's head. The thing held eye contact with Clayton for a long while as the two stood on the Aberdeen cliff. Suddenly, with more strength and speed than the boy would have been able to muster on his own, the monster forced Clayton's rock-holding hand down onto its own head, crushing its skull and killing it instantly. The body of the beast started burning with red and white flames, and Clayton inched away from the fire, back towards the pasture. He stared at the fire with sullen, sad eyes and thought of the terrible thing he'd come to the cliff to do. He shook his head, realizing it wasn't worth his life to run from who he really was. The people he knew and loved would make fun of the things he'd done, the things they knew, and Clayton knew that it would be painful. He knew that people wouldn't look at him the same way ever again, but he also knew that living without the mask of his secrets was an experience worth having. Clayton felt sorry for the monster and stayed with the thing's burning body on the cliff until the flames had consumed every bit of the monster's flesh and bones. The disgusting, deformed beast of secrets had given its life to prove to Clayton that he was living a lie, and as the boy redressed and sat on the rocky cliff, he thought about the strangeness of what he'd witnessed. Secrets rule over all those who keep them, whether young or old. There are things we would prefer nobody ever knew. In most cases, secrets are harmless, but the ones we hold closest are the ones we will imagine will change our lives. If someone discovered your secrets, what would come of you? Would you be able to continue living the same life you do now if all the masks you wore suddenly shattered? The answer to that is the same for all of us, and it doesn't take a monster to prove it. Hey guys, I really hope you enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun to write. Like I said at the video's intro, I actually wrote that live on stream with the help of our stream followers, the viewership at the time, and that was a lot of fun. A lot of people seemed to enjoy it, so I hope that all of you did as well. So I wanted to give a super big shout out to just a few people here. I started off with the themes that it was going to be super scary and about a monster, and Aaron Hall 21 in the stream suggested that we added porn as a theme, so that was his doing. Thank you, Aaron Hall 21. Let's see here. We have Aberdeen, Scotland. The setting was created by Ricky WW in stream. Thank you for that. We have Mr. Foxy 21 added the name Ben. That's his real life name, and that's one of the names of the gay parents. Also, Echo Pig, his real life name is Deuce, and so he was one of the other gay parents. Big shout out to Mr. Foxy21 and Echo Pig, thank you both. Almost Addicted, his real life name is Andrew, and he wanted to be a cow for some reason, so thanks, Almost Addicted, appreciate you, man. The always lovely Shimmershine69, who of course her real name is Sam, wanted to be a porn star, I guess, so there we go. Sammy loved the porn star, as played by Shimmershine69, and of course, Joe F6 II being Nostalgia, my chess companion, who taught me why I should never play F6 move 2, so F6 II. Big old shout out to Joe. And last but certainly not least, XX the Ender Gamer XX for giving us the description of the Beast of Secrets. So big thank you to all the people who contributed to this story. If you want to contribute to the next story, head on over to www.twitch.tv/Timalik. That's my live stream page, and click that follow button. You'll get a notification whenever I go live, and then hopefully we can see you in the next story. Maybe we can get this published somewhere, who knows. If you guys are interested in that, get in contact with me. But I really enjoyed the hell out of doing this. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it. My name is Timalik. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you all next time. See you guys.
He's staring at our Aberdeen heart, London eyes, Glasgow bones. She's whistling the catacombs, a paradox. He's in love with the statue in a marble block. He's in love with the girl that time forgot. She just shakes her